Missiles, drones, and small boats were back in the Strait of Hormuz as U.S. destroyers and Iranian forces traded fire in the clearest test yet of a ceasefire neither side says is over. This morning, the Hormuz clash and shipping freeze, New York's move against ICE cooperation, and a new fatal U.S. bird flu case. Welcome to the World Scan Daily. I'm Aya. Today is Friday, May 8th. U.S. Central Command said American forces intercepted attacks on 3 Navy destroyers and then struck Iranian military sites in self-defense. Iran said the U.S. violated the truce by hitting vessels and coastal areas, while President Trump insisted the ceasefire is still in effect. The practical stakes sit well beyond the warships. Hormuz remains one of the world's most important energy choke points, and it is now behaving like one. The commercial disruption is already severe. The International Maritime Organization says about 1,500 ships and 20,000 seafarers remain trapped in the Gulf because of the blockade. The agency says a humanitarian corridor is being prepared for stranded crews once mine and attack risks fall, and it warns the disruption reaches chemicals and fertilizers, as well as oil and gas. The market damage may also outlast any headline about reopening. Maersk says even if Hormuz reopens, cargo flows would not quickly normalize because shipping networks are already distorted and fuel costs have surged. Its chief executive said the company's fuel bill has nearly doubled, adding roughly $500 million a month that is being passed on to customers. That is how a naval exchange becomes a household cost story. Still in the same conflict, a satellite review suggests Iran's earlier strikes damaged far more U.S. military infrastructure than Washington had publicly acknowledged. Reports summarizing the analysis say at least 228 structures or pieces of equipment were damaged across 15 U.S. sites in the region, including hangars, barracks, fuel storage, and key radar and communication systems. Analysts cited in the coverage say the pattern points to vulnerabilities in sheltering, drone defense, and the protection of fixed bases. A U.S. military spokesperson pushed back on claims that the damage automatically proves severe failure, saying battle damage assessment is complex and can mislead. Even so, the transparency question is now part of the story. Washington is also tightening the economic screws around Iran's oil trade. The Treasury Department sanctioned Iraq's deputy oil minister, Ali Marai al-Bahadli, accusing him of helping blend Iranian crude with Iraqi oil and falsify paperwork so it could be sold as Iraqi exports. The U.S. also designated leaders from Iran-backed militias, tying the sanctions to attacks on U.S. personnel and to financing networks linked to Tehran. Iraq's oil ministry denied the accusations and said it was ready to cooperate with any fair investigation. So this is not just about sanctions pressure on Iran. It is also a stress test for Baghdad. From war and shipping to state power at home, the next fight is legal and immediate. In New York, state leaders say a new budget deal will sharply limit cooperation with federal immigration enforcement and bar most law enforcement officers from wearing masks while on duty. The package would prohibit state and local officials from formally assisting ICE on federal immigration efforts and would require judicial warrants for ICE entry into schools, healthcare facilities, homes, and other sensitive locations. Governor Kathy Hochul says the state is acting as a guardrail against overreach. The Trump administration is expected to challenge the measures, and the Department of Homeland Security has already called the mask restriction unconstitutional. That turns a budget deal into a direct state versus federal clash. A different kind of pressure point comes from public health. Federal reporting detailed a fatal human H5N5 avian flu case in Washington state, linked to a backyard duck flock and contaminated environmental samples on the patient's property. Genomic sequencing found the patient's virus closely matched samples from the ducks and a watering basin. Investigators tracked about 135 exposed people and found no additional cases during monitoring. Officials still say the overall risk to the general U.S. population remains low. But a documented fatal infection with a novel subtype is not something health agencies enjoy filing quietly. In Brussels, the European Union reached a provisional AI deal that cuts two ways at once. It would ban AI systems used to create child sexual abuse material and non-consensual explicit deepfakes of adults, including images, video, and audio. At the same time, the EU agreed to delay some broader obligations for high-risk AI systems, with critics arguing Europe is easing enforcement under industry pressure. Supporters say they are clarifying the rules, not weakening safety. Either way, this will shape the operating environment for major AI companies far beyond Europe. In Germany, the government cut its tax revenue outlook, saying weaker growth and the energy shock tied to the Iran war are blowing a hole in public finances. The new estimate points to 17.8 billion euros less in tax revenue in 2026 than previously expected, for federal, state, and local governments combined. Berlin now expects the shortfall to keep compounding through the end of the decade. Europe's largest economy is effectively saying the war is already showing up in fiscal math, not just in fuel prices. A quick reset now because security pressure is spreading in very different directions. In Latvia, authorities are investigating drones that entered from Russian airspace and crashed near an empty oil storage facility in the country's east. 4 empty tanks were damaged, with minor smoldering reported, and Riga summoned Russia's chargé d'affaires to deliver a protest note. Latvia says the incident shows how Moscow's war is creating regional security risks beyond Ukraine itself. Russian reporting tried to fold the episode into a wider story about Ukrainian drone activity and NATO aircraft, which leaves the wider picture contested. But a NATO member dealing with cross-border drone debris near oil infrastructure is clear enough on its own. In China, 2 former defense ministers, Wei Fenghe and Li Shangfu, received suspended death sentences in the military corruption purge. State media said both were convicted on bribery-related charges, with the sentences set to convert to life terms after 2 years, and with no reduction or parole. The significance is political as much as legal. Beijing is showing that even former top military figures remain vulnerable in Xi Jinping's continuing campaign to remake and discipline the armed forces. Back in the United States, a Reuters review says the Trump administration's immigration surge in Minneapolis sharply slowed other federal crime investigations and prosecutions. The review found gun and drug cases fell dramatically. Some prosecutors quit, and some federal agents were pulled away from gang and task force work. Trump had framed the operation as an urgent crime-fighting push focused on violent offenders. The review argues the opposite effect also appeared. Other serious public safety work was disrupted. That is a resource allocation story, not just an immigration story. Across Mississippi, multiple tornadoes damaged hundreds of homes and injured at least 17 people. Emergency officials said the storms tore through several counties, with especially heavy destruction in mobile home communities and neighborhoods south of Jackson. Officials said more than 1,000 homes and other buildings may have been damaged, but no deaths had been confirmed as of Thursday. For residents, that is the small mercy after a very large night. A quieter but meaningful signal from the Ukraine war. The European Union says it will not pull its diplomats out of Kyiv despite Moscow's warning tied to Victory Day security threats. Embassy presence has become a political signal in its own right. In Russia, authorities in Perm canceled the May 9th military parade after reports of a Ukrainian strike on oil infrastructure there. The war is now altering public ritual and security planning deep inside Russia. The Kremlin also published a guest list for the Moscow celebrations that included leaders and delegations from Belarus, Laos, Malaysia, Slovakia, and Republika Srpska. It is a small map of who is still willing to be seen in that company. One signaling note. U.S. and Iranian officials and mediators said a short-term framework to pause the war was under discussion, but Tehran had not accepted it, and the Hormuz fighting cast fresh doubt over the effort. And one early report to watch? News outlets said Florida and federal officials were discussing winding down the Everglades Detention Center. but the status of any closure plan remained disputed. That is the scan for this morning. New briefing every morning by 5:30 a.m. ET.